So far in our debate about whether the internet is democratizing the world, we've focused on the positive hope, right? That it is, that there's a democratic structure, that ultimately that democratic structure allows for increased voice for those people who didn't have it before. It was extremely important in the Arab Spring, in a number of different events, and in things that we use all the time, like Wikipedia. But there are a lot of people, and for a long period of time, that have said, not so fast, right? They critique the democratizing potential of the internet as exactly that, a sort of idealistic hope that is not at all realistic. And chief among those who critique this potential democratizing power is Yevgeny Morozov, the author of The Net Delusion. And while he might be considered someone who is extremely negative, or someone who doesn't see the positive events and effects of the internet, he is extremely accurate and articulate about the realities of the internet and the complexities of how this actually takes place, of the democratic potential and the democratic realities taking place around the world. And the first of his criticisms is what he calls the Google doctrine, the idea that this strategy is lazy. The Google doctrine is essentially the belief in the liberating power of technology, that if enough people are connected online, if social media is accessed by enough people, that enough outside funding is given to organizations and people who need it in order to spread their word, that authoritarian regimes are just going to topple over and fall apart, that the technology will determine this democratic wave that will unleash itself across the world. The reality is that this is a laissez-faire approach to democratization. It is essentially lazy, and the technology itself will not do anything. The technology is a very important tool, but Morozov realizes that without very consistent use, and without governments that allow this to happen, it will be a very difficult thing to create democracies or topple authoritarian regimes using new tools. Ultimately, the reason for this is the power of the state. Remember about this place called China, right? Ultimately, China is one great example, and we'll look into exactly how the power of the state is really rearing its head in China in terms of what they call the Great Firewall of China. But ultimately, the first place we should look is a country we've already discussed a little bit, which is Iran. Now, keep in mind what we take for granted today in the United States. We take for granted much of the freedom of expression that we actually have, the access to information that we have, especially when it comes to online communication. If we were going to use tools to organize, say, the Occupy movement that happened in the United States just a couple of years ago, we faced relatively little resistance from the government. We faced relatively little resistance from any traditional sources, other than potentially being brought up on charges of disrupting the peace or something like that. Compare that to a place like Iran, the Green Revolution. Shortly after the Green Revolution started, people started to receive this text. Holy crap. I mean, this is a whole different level, right? Imagine receiving this text. Imagine how it feels to know that you could use these new tools, but ultimately you could face extremely harsh punishments as a result. It really puts everything in perspective, and the power that is supposedly shifting with these new technologies is anything but automatic. Now if we shift briefly to China, we're going to watch a really interesting video that really takes a look at both aspects here. There are actions taken by the people to use the internet to disseminate information throughout China, some of which is even critical of the government, and there are very interesting techniques used by the government to help control information, control what information citizens receive, how citizens can use that information, and this battle going back and forth is very much a people-powered process, even though the issue at stake is really a technological one and an information-based one. So pay attention to this back and forth chess match that's happening in China, and think about whether you think that the Chinese government is really being threatened here, if their control is really at stake.